Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I am Margo Vaselli with Becker's Hospital Review. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. We are pleased to have Scott Becker, publisher of Becker's Healthcare, here to moderate today's question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have through the webinar by typing in your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We are looking forward to hearing your questions. Additionally, in about a week following the webinar, we'll be sending you a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. At this time, it is now my pleasure to start today's webinar by introducing our presenters for today. Dr. Richard Iorio is Chief of Adult Reconstruction Division at NYU Langone Orthopedic Hospital. He designed and successfully implemented the Bundled Care Payment Initiative for total joints, as well as developed and initiated their faculty same-day total joint program. Dr. Iorio is the chair of American Association of Hip and Knee Surgeons Committee on Advocacy and Healthcare Policy. He is nationally recognized as a thought leader on perioperative risk optimization. Dr. Joseph Bosco is Vice Chairman of Clinical Affairs and the Director of the Center for Quality and Patient Safety at NYU Langone Orthopedic Hospital. He is a practicing orthopedic surgeon recognized as a thought leader in a value-based payment and quality, as well as an experienced consultant. Dr. Bosco has been named Castle Connolly Top Doctors for the New York metro area and most recently received the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons Achievement Award. Lorraine Hutzler is the Associate Director of the Center for Quality and Patient Safety at NYU Langone Orthopedic Hospital. She designed, built, and maintains a robust quality infrastructure for the Department of Orthopedic Surgery. Lorraine has extensive expertise in quality metrics management and reporting, as well as Lean and Six Sigma certification. Dr. Bosco, I'll now turn the floor over to you to begin today's presentation.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. So initially, we're going to talk, I'm going to start about where we are right now and how technology really can add value to our total joint episodes. So obviously, you know, traditionally we were fee for service. You know, we made widgets and we got paid for making widgets, regardless of the quality of what we made. And then that sort of transitioned to value-based, linked to quality. So we were graded on how many readmissions and complications that we had. And part of our reimbursements is linked to those quality-based. Now we've sort of evolved the transition to alternate delivery models, accountable care organizations, patient-centered medical homes, and what we're going to talk about mostly is bundled care and bundled payment. And why an orthopedic surgeon would be interested in that is because basically total joint arthroplasty are perfect for bundling. They're defined episodes. The attribution is very easy. It's easy to figure out who's in the episode. They're easily compared because it's a homogeneous type procedure. There's a lot of them done, and they're expensive, and the government pays for most of them. And then I think the final evolutionary step would be population health. And you know, as orthopedic surgeons, we think that it's going to stop short of true population health for the United States, but you know, obviously we could be wrong. Next slide, please. So again, and part of how as surgeons and clinicians we're going to get paid is by merit-based incentive program, or MIPS, and that's going to be based on how we do on several quality metrics. And I think the biggest thing to remember is that no matter what the quality metrics are, if you're in merit-based incentive program and Medicare, you can either get plus or minus 9% of your reimbursement. And that's a zero-sum game. So for everyone who gets 9% more, there's going to be someone who gets 9% less. But if you qualify for APM, which is a advanced practice profile, then you could be exempt from MIPS, and you get a 5% increase in reimbursement. So just to review, you could be in MIPS and you could be plus or minus 9% on how much you get paid, which is based on arcane quality metrics, or you can opt out of MIPS and join a APM, and you automatically get a 5% boost. So obviously, most of us would want to be an APM. Next. So CJR is going to qualify as an APM. That's why orthopedic surgeons want to be in it. And so many of you are listening, saying, "Well, didn't Tom Price just kill the CJR? Didn't I just read about something that happened a couple months ago where he canceled it?" Well, we don't think that couldn't be further from the truth. Certainly, CMS did offer a opinion and a rule that is open for debate now, where they decreased the amount of MSAs, metropolitan statistical areas in CJR by half, but they kept the most expensive ones in, so it minimized the financial risk. And they understand also that that mandatory participation is probably not the best way to do it, so it's going to be voluntary. But it's our position, and the position of most of people that understand this, is that physicians and healthcare providers, including hospitals, are going to want to opt in for some type of bundled payment because the upside is substantial. And if they're going to compete in this competitive landscape for commercial bundles, then they need to understand how bundled payment works, and need to understand and work out the kinks in the infrastructure in a Medicare bundle where you just compare it against yourself before you foray into a commercial bundle where you have a lot more to lose. So, and technology is certainly a major driver in this. And I'll just end with this by saying that, if it wasn't for EMRs, there could be no bundled payment or none other these other coordinated care, because you need an EMR, electronic medical record, to coordinate your care. Next slide. Go ahead, Rich.
Hi, this is Rich Iorio. Thanks for joining us. NYU went into the bundle payment program in 2013, and we've learned some valuable lessons from our experience. We've had all successful reconciliations with CMS over our bundle payment program. But as we entered the program and went through it, we discovered 5 different clinical pillars of bundle payment success, and we're going to go through those for you today. The first one is optimizing patient selection and comorbidities. Next slide, please. So we use a number of different technologies to help us augment our care coordination pathways as well as our selection of implants. And one of the major issues we found was that the comorbidity burden of the patients we operate on have a great impact on the results of the operation, readmission rates, length of stay, and admission to post-acute facilities. We've developed some tools to stratify these patients into the readmission risks. Next slide, please. And we've quantified the readmission rates for these comorbidities. Patients with many comorbidities, say a morbidly obese patient who smokes and has diabetes out of control, can have 10 to 20 times higher rates of readmission than standard risk patients. Next slide, please. We've come up with many programs to alter and optimize these risk factors to help these patients get through their length of stay and their episode a lot more efficiently. Next slide, please. And those programs have resulted in decreasing readmission rates. The readmission rate for Medicare patients of any diagnosis in this country over 90 days is 18%. So getting our readmission rates now down, now in the 5.8% range for our current fiscal year is really a big accomplishment. And we're not denying care to these patients. We're just delaying the joint replacement until they can modify their risk factors. And activating these patients is really the key, and engaging them in their care through some of these technological innovations is very important. Next slide. And here's some statistics that show how we've decreased readmission rates to a significant degree and also saved a bunch of money by doing this. Next slide.
So thanks, Richard. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about the second pillar, which is optimizing care coordination throughout the bundle. So basically, it's care management and all about patients getting seamless care during care transitions. For instance, when they're admitted to the hospital, when they're discharged home, so that the ball is not dropped and they're each getting the same message. Next slide, please. So clinical management throughout the pathway is essential for a bundle, because in the bundle you have different care times, right? They're inpatient, they're discharged home, there's post-acute care. They could be discharged home, they could be discharged to a SNF or an inpatient facility, and at some point they're going to go home without services. And during all this time, their care has to be coordinated. And we find it best if the care is coordinated by a single person, and the operating surgeon is probably not the best person who's coordinating this care, because there's different messages. So obviously, you know, that care coordination is done by nurses or nurse practitioners in our case, but it's very important that whether it's adherence to order sets or adherence to medication that they're discharged on, that technology be leveraged. And that technology could be in the form of web-based follow-ups, questionnaires, web-based check-in, web-based physical therapy. For instance, if a patient's not taking their medication or not weighing themselves every day, that could be sent back to the nurses, and the nurses can call the patient up and ask them why. So again, using technology to keep track of the patient throughout every part of this episode is vitally important. Next slide, please. Okay, so, and again, you know, this is how we've really changed, to get alignment between the clinician, the technology, and the physicians and patient. It used to be that care was fragmented, which led to many gaps in communication and errors in care. But now, if it's all coordinated, utilizing technology, there's increased alignment for all providers, and more importantly, the message is the same. So when you have a physician at our institution, we have 120 orthopedic surgeons that actively operate, and 30 of them do joint replacements. So it's very difficult to have each physician give the same message. Some are better at it than others. But if you have a care coordinator that does that for them, the messaging is taken out of the physician's hand and a lot of times, and the variation is decreased. So this is all about increasing alignment. Next slide.
So now we'll go on to the third pillar of clinical care, and this is very important. In today's opiate-soaked world, and with a crisis, if any of you saw 60 Minutes last night, that goes well beyond the traditional drug abuser mentality, we've made a great progress in trying to treat patients for pain management after joint replacement with a multimodal program that minimizes narcotics. Now, this not only helps them rehabilitate quicker and minimizes the complications associated with narcotic, it also helps us save some money within the bundle. Next slide, please. So what we like to do is combine these multimodal drugs with some periarticular injections and some anesthesia techniques in order to keep our pain control at an acceptable level, decrease our narcotic use, improve our functional milestones, and improve our quality metrics. Next slide, please. One way to do this is we've minimized the use of femoral nerve blocks. We've minimized patient-controlled analgesia use after surgery, and we've added liposomal bupivacaine as an adjunct to periarticular injections to help us with pain control in these patients in the first 36 to 48 hours in order to facilitate rapid rehabilitation and discharge from the hospital with minimal narcotic use. Next slide, please. Using this multimodal approach with liposomal bupivacaine, the elimination of femoral nerve blocks, and the elimination of patient-controlled anesthesia, along with other pharmaceutical agents, we've achieved equivalent pain control. We decreased our narcotic use. We get our patients moving faster and get them into physical therapy in a shorter amount of time. We've decreased our fall rates. We've We've markedly decreased our length of stay. We've improved discharge to home and decreased discharge to post-acute facilities. We've improved our pain-related HCAHPS, and we've significantly decreased our hospital cost. Next, please.
Okay, thanks, Rich. For the next couple of slides, I'm going to be talking about the fourth pillar, which is really controlling VTE risks and optimizing blood management. Next slide. So obviously, you know, blood clots and VTEs, venous thrombotic events, are very prevalent after joint replacement. And if you minimize these, you'll be more successful in bundling payment. And one of the hallmarks of minimizing them is doing risk stratification, because not everyone needs the same amount of VTE prophylaxis. So if you over prophylax everyone, you'll get more bleeding and more wound complications. If you under prophylax people, you get a higher risk of VTE. So in order to do this, you have to risk stratify people. And we leverage our EMR for risk stratification, in that we have a risk stratification score on our EMR that everyone needs to be filled out. And if that score is a certain amount, it steers the clinicians to a certain VTE prophylaxis regimen. So if a person has a very high risk for VTEs, they can't order just aspirin and foot pumps unless there's an issue. But they're guided to the appropriate evidence-based VTE regimen, prophylaxis regimen, which again really takes the physician variation out of a lot of these decisions. Next slide. And here's this just shows our part of our VTE risk, in that we took risk stratification. We divided joint replacements into standard risk and high risk patients. And for the standard risk, we gave aspirin and foot pumps. And for the high risk, we gave a higher level of anticoagulation with enoxaparin. Next. And what we found is that cohort 2 had a lower incidence of VTE than the group treated with aggressive anticoagulation. And most importantly, there was a decrease in adverse events, readmissions, infections, and bleeding-related complications in the risk-stratified protocol. So by giving each patient the appropriate amount of VTE prophylaxis, we maximize the decrease in VTEs and minimize the rate of infections. And it was less expensive. But good medicine is always less expensive. So we think that it's essential to use risk stratification for VTE to make sure that everyone gets the appropriate amount of VTE prophylaxis. Next slide. The other thing that we do, which is evidence-based, is also blood management. The bottom line is transfusions, whether autologous or autogenous, are bad for people. They increase infection rates, they increase cost, they increase length of stay. So if you can restrict the amount of transfusions you give a patient, that's good for patients, and it's good for your bottom line. So we use transfusion triggers. It used to be that anyone with a hemoglobin less than 10 would get transfused. Now that's gone down to 7 with good evidence-based, published in the New England Journal of Medicine. We use TXA, tranexamic acid, which is generic, which I think that Rich and I would, and many thought leaders in this field would tell you, if you do a total joint and you're not using TXA and the patient's a candidate for TXA, you're probably operating at below standard of care. I think TXA is fast becoming the standard of care. Regional anesthetic, more than general anesthetic, again, standard of care unless there's a problem. We don't use drains. We're careful surgeons. And again, we avoid aggressive anticoagulation. Next slide. Okay, go ahead, Rich.
So the fifth pillar is minimizing post-acute facilities and resource utilization. As we're finding, the best place for a patient to get cared for after an operation is home. Certainly there are exceptions for people that need extended care facilities, but we think over 80% of patients can go home in the New York area, and I think it's closer to 90 or 95% in some other more horizontal environments. Next slide. At our first cohort, when we looked at our readmissions based on discharge location, when patients were discharged to a subacute nursing facility, their risk of readmission was 2 times higher than the patients that went home. And this was the same whether when we adjusted for comorbidities as well. Next slide, please. So we tried to transmit protocols to many of our subacute partners. We had 20-something facilities in the New York area that we were discharging patients to. Unfortunately, that was too many. We couldn't control the quality in those other facilities, and frankly, those facilities had very little incentive to cooperate with us because they got paid per diem. They got paid 100% of their per diem rate up to 21 days and 50% up to 42 days. And shockingly, the average length of stay was about 21 days, which is what you would expect given their financial incentives. As a result, we went to a narrow network. We had one favored provider in each borough of New York, and then we actually took over a rehabilitation facility in Brooklyn called Lutheran, Augustana, and we were able to significantly cut our post-acute stay and decrease our costs. Next slide, please. You can see the purple line represents the quality metrics at Augustana. We have direct contact with those physicians. They're NYU physicians, so they follow our protocols. We have telemedicine contact within that hospital, and our care coordinators are able to visit our patients there, keeping the communication line intact in a much more efficient way of doing things. I strongly would advise you to narrow your network. CMS does require you to give patients choices as to where they go post-op, but you don't have to give them every choice, and you certainly can make decisions based on quality. Next slide, please. And we have a little change in strategy. We tend to keep patients in the hospital longer if they're going to need a subacute nursing facility, so that we can see if they're on the borderline. We would rather keep them in our hospital where we can keep an eye on them and control the post-op protocols rather than sending to a subacute nursing facility. You can keep people in the hospital up to 8-9 days and still make money in the bundle rather than sending them to a SNF. Next slide, please.
Okay, so I'm going to talk next about creating value and how that's basically a problem of simple mathematics. Michael Porter in 2010 in the New England Journal of Medicine article defined value in healthcare as outcomes divided by cost. And outcomes are outcomes which matters to patients, like HCAHPS scores and mobility scores, rather than just how X-rays look. And the cost, obviously, is the cost of providing these outcomes. So theoretically, though, you can create value if cost is decreased by 50% and outcomes are decreased by 10%. Just simple fourth grade mathematics will tell you that value is increased. However, in medicine, it's ethically not tenable for any decrease in cost to come with any associated decrease in outcomes. So any kind of decrease in cost you have has to either leave outcomes the same or actually improve outcomes. So, many of us say, well, how can you decrease costs and improve outcomes? That's sort of the holy grail, and there are certain things you can do to help that. And we're going to introduce a term here called Incremental Cost Effectiveness Rate, or ICER. And that basically is for every increase in cost of a new intervention or prosthesis, how much improvement in outcome are you getting? So it used to be that we didn't really care about this in medicine. If something was 10 times more expensive and it only provided 10% better outcomes, we adopt it. But nowadays, with a finite amount of money being in medicine and resources, we can't afford to do things that may be 10 times more expensive with only a 5% or 10% increase in outcomes. So for every new prosthesis or intervention used, you have to find an incremental cost effectiveness rate or ratio. And again, if you want to increase value, the good way is increasing costs and increasing outcomes at a higher or equal amount. That will improve value. And the way you do that is by, you have a prosthesis that's a little bit more expensive, but you know what? The outcomes more than make up for the increased expense. The better way of doing it is decreasing costs without affecting outcomes, and that would be, again, by using maybe the same prosthesis you always use, but getting at a cheaper price. and we could talk more about that later on. The best way is decreasing costs while improving outcomes. Now, how do you do that? Well, two things. One, you restrict transfusions, right? So if you decrease the amount of transfusions, it's less expensive and it's better for the patients. Or, as Rich alluded to, you could send patients home after the joint replacement rather than to an inpatient facility, because we know if they go home, the outcomes are better and it's less expensive. So by discharging patients to home following a joint replacement, you are improving value by both decreasing costs and improving outcomes. Next slide.
So this gets back to the value-based implant point that Joe made. There are now a number of implant companies in this country making high-quality implants at a much lower price. Many of the implants that we currently put in are rise in cost every year. The price of implants has gone up 8% a year, and it's unclear whether we're getting value for that increase in price as industry innovates. There have been some innovations that have helped, like highly cross-linked polyethylene, but there are others that have significantly hurt, such as metal-on-metal technology. But just like generic pharmaceuticals, generic implants can bring billions in savings annually and are the next logical step to pursue value. Next slide. These are the companies that are now producing these type of implants. They're much smaller than the big five orthopedic device manufacturers, but these technologies are using off-patent designs from the big five and incorporating them into their devices, and they look every bit as good and work just every bit as well as the big five devices. They just don't have a clinical track record. Once they get some experience and some data, I think this will be a sea change in the industry, and the big five will need to decrease their prices in order to compete. Next slide, please. So the first step is physician alignment. These physicians generally choose which implant they use, but you can remove unnecessary costs if the buyers, the hospital, can align with the physicians and choose implants that are less expensive. And as reimbursements decline, ASCs and acute care facilities are going to have to cut back their costs, and they will do that through using less expensive implants. Once again, hospitals and ASCs can become owners of the implants and the instruments and the process that allows these savings by aligning with physicians and helping the surgeons with some added resources or perhaps some gain sharing or co-management in order to share in these proceeds. Next slide, please. And bundling drives value, right? Incentivizing the surgeons to find better value will certainly help drive these prices down, because the surgeons then have skin in the game. And as we get away from fee-for-service, this will incentivize the surgeons to help the hospital to not only improve their quality, but also decrease their costs. And hopefully academic and larger hospitals with better resources will allow their surgeons to share in the benefits of these programs. Next. And in the end, the large companies will come to the table with value-based pricing in order to sell their implants. They may vertically integrate some of their services and provide other benefits to the hospitals, such as bandages and sutures and other product lines, cardiac, diabetes, et cetera. And they'll want volume commitments for fixed pricing, and that's fine. If you can get your surgeons on board, everyone can share in this price reduction. We just committed to 75% of our volume to one manufacturer with a significant decrease in savings for our total joint implant costs. So it's worked out pretty well for us. Next slide.
So, and now I'm going to talk about something that basically when Rich and I were training back in the mid-'80s was like an anathema. That would be same-day discharge total joint arthroplasty, outpatient total joint arthroplasty, which is really gaining traction throughout the country. You know, when we first started training, the patients were admitted the night before for total joints, and the average length of stay was 10 or 11 days. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, the average length of stay is far less, and no one's being admitted the night before. And SG2, a consulting company, projected the number of outpatient joint replacements will increase by 200% over the next decade. And we wholeheartedly agree with this. That basically translates to approximately 20% of all hip and knee replacement procedures that orthopedic surgeons perform will be outpatient by 2025. And we think that is actually going to be even higher for hip replacements because they're a lot easier to perform as an outpatient basis. Next slide. We have forayed into outpatient total joints at NYU. You know, we're a very big academic medical center, so we change at the speed of a glacier. You know, it's like trying to turn an oil tanker. But basically, we're cautious about things, especially in New York, because there's not a lot of people who have gone to this. But we looked at in 2016 to 3,500 or so patients who received total joints in 2016, and using our criteria, about 70% of these patients would have been medically eligible to have their surgery performed as a same-day surgery. Over a third of the ASA Class 3 patients were found to be eligible. Most of the ASA Class 2 patients and 1 were totally eligible. And what was our biggest cause? Was a BMI over 40, was they were ineligible, and severity of comorbidities, and untreated sleep apnea or snoring. Next. And when we looked at our HCAPs, of the 500 patients we have done as outpatients, got home the same day, our HCAP scores were much higher. Patients loved it. And basically, the less time patients spend in a hospital, the happier they are. The happier they are. Next slide. So, what's the future? We think there's 3 possible venues for same-day surgery. Hospital. So you could, as we do right now, they can come to the hospital and just go home the same day. They can be done in a freestanding ASC, which means ambulatory care center, which is, you know, not physically connected to a hospital. Which again, you know, it's like doing a tightrope act without a net. Because if they can't stay overnight, and there's no room overnight, they have to go home. I mean, they have to go to a hospital. Or you can use a specialized orthopedic facility, which Move Health and a couple other companies are coming up with, where they can stay overnight in a monitored bed. And same-day surgery is a lot more profitable than non-same-day total joint arthroplasty. That's why big physician-led groups of orthopedic surgeons are heading into this full speed ahead. And even in Medicare, the financials are very positive for same-day surgeries. So again, and at NYU, when we looked at it, we thought that our bottom line would be increased 25% if we can transfer as many patients as we can to same-day surgery, done in a safe, effective manner. Next.
So now we're going to talk about, you know, we talked about incremental cost effectiveness rates and how they affect hospital cost and what we do in a single hospitalization. Maybe we need to start thinking about this technology as it applies to all new technology introductions, and we need to think about it as it is applied to the episode of care. Does this increase in cost also increase outcomes? And when you look at drugs, implants, and new technologies for surgeries, do they absolutely decrease the cost of the episode over time rather than just looking at the hospital cost? Because I think in the future we're going to go to 90-day DRGs as a cost for total joint replacement. So we need to look at these technologies and whether or not they decrease the complication rates in the short term. In reality, for the patient population, these things really are a 30-year episode of care at this point, but we're far away from going in that direction at this time. So we have a formalized institutional mechanism to make these calculations. We have a new products committee that makes these decisions, and it has to be quantitative or at least very highly qualitatively justified. Next slide. As Joe talked about, we need to increase the quality and decrease the cost and the payment. We like to establish ceiling prices for commonly used implants and other items used in the care pathway. We want to minimize routine laboratory testing. Most post-acute PACU labs are very rarely acted upon. Joe's done some studies that show that we probably spend about $25,000 to produce one lab result that we actually act on. So think about it before you order that CBC in a total knee patient with a tourniquet on 2 hours after the operation. Blood management we spoke about, minimizing the number of transfusions, getting rid of auto transfusion devices and cell savers, using TXA, minimizing the use of antibiotic cement to those patients who are high risk, decreasing OR waste and the implant and equipment that you sterilize and open up in the operating room. Use some technology ahead of time to make sure the right implants are at the right place at the right time. And of course, decreasing complications and readmissions goes back to our discussion about optimizing patients and decreasing the comorbidity burden before you operate on them. And that will lead to decreased post-acute care facility admissions and decreased complications. Next, please. So you need to examine your care pathways and your order sets. All the interventions should add value. Get rid of the routine things that you really don't act on. Get rid of silly things that don't really add to the benefit of the patient, such as Aquamanus, which costs $500 a case, and if you're routinely using TXA, probably isn't necessary. But if you want to use it in a revision that's going to be bloody and in a brittle patient, sure, that's fine, but don't make it routine. Do you really need to do the spiral CT scan for pulmonary embolism on that patient? You know, if they're not retaining CO2 and they only had a marginal drop in oxygenation, you know, wait a little bit, see how they do clinically. You don't have to get the full range of tests on everybody. Make sure it's clinically indicated. And as we've begun to do, we now only use one bag of cement in most routine total knee replacements. We also sent out our cement for competitive bidding, so we use only one manufacturer's cement, and we restrict its use to high comorbidity patients and high-risk patients for the use of antibiotic within the cement. Next slide. Joe?
Okay, so another way to increase value is by having patients have their surgery done at high volume centers of excellence, right? And we know that that outcomes occur, and this is a curve of an article that we did looking at outcomes versus volume for mining accidents, for nuclear plant explosions, for submarine, for a lot of things, and the red triangles look at flashing, what we did at our hospital. So the more we did, the more we concentrated on it, our learning curve increased and the less amount of flashing that we had to do. But again, these learning curves are all the same no matter what is learned. And we found that learning has to do with the amount of mistakes you make and the time it takes to make mistakes. So if you make 10 mistakes a year, you learn from your mistakes. If your volume is so low, you make one mistake every 5 years, you're not going to learn from that mistake. So again, you know, learning theory shows that high volume centers and high volume surgeons tend to have better results. Next slide. And this is a study at New York State where we found that high volume centers did have a lower infection rate. But in New York, they were a little bit more costly because they were in urban centers. But basically, high volume centers have better outcomes. Next slide, please.
So these are some of the partners that Joe and I work with, and also we work with at NYU. And we've made the move toward adopting technology to help us decrease the use of FTEs in these bundled arrangements. But what we found is the discipline that was imparted on us in the bundle, and by moving to some of these technology partners, not only could we save money and maybe we didn't need to hire all those FTEs, but it also showed that the quality improvements that we made then accrued to our other product lines outside the bundle. And as a result, you know, when you multiply $4,000 by say $7,000 or $8,000 of savings in each hospital episode, that begins to be real money, even in New York. Next slide, please. So we try and bring value, you know, to the bundled episodes. We think the bundles are good examples of how you can use a framework to measure the amount of value brought to a diagnosis. And using bundle payments as an example is one way you can sort of teach your hospital to do this. And it doesn't apply just to joint replacement. It applies to many other episodes of care that are discrete and elective in the hospital. Next slide, please. This is an example of what our reconciliation was like before we implemented the bundle. The orange represents the number of post-acute care admissions. The red represents the amount of readmissions. Anything above the line, we lost money on. Anything below the line, we made money on. And this was a positive reconciliation. But next slide, please. You know, after we implemented these bundled payments, and we added these other two pillars of excellence, you can see that our results are better. Next slide. Joe, want to talk about the dashboards?
Yeah, so if you go back one slide too, you don't mind, can we reverse? Good. So when Rich came up with the 5 pillars, I'm a big fan of Sir Lawrence of Arabia and his seminal book, The 7 Pillars of Wisdom. So I asked Rich if we could come up with 2 more pillars, so we could call it the 7 Pillars of Wisdom. But so anyways, the 2 other, the number 6 would be data. And these decisions have to be data-driven. The data needs to be transparent, needs to be in real time, needs to be believable, and needs to be accurate. Next slide. So, and this is our dashboard, and we have physicians A, B, C, and D, but in real life, these are transparent. So there's not physician A. Physician A will be my name, or B will be someone else's name, but this is for everyone to see and shared. And this data is almost real time, so it's actionable. If you when you participate in a Medicare bundle, Medicare will give you your data, but it's usually 6 to 9 months after the episode, so that the data is not really actionable because it's too late. So like any other business, the person has a competitive advantage that they have the better data that's real time. So for instance, if a certain physician or a certain floor of the hospital has a run of infections or a run of bad results, you want to know about that at the time so you can deal with it rather than 6 months later or 8 months later when it's too late. You can't deal with it. So this is very important for us. Next slide, please. And this is our these are some other ways we look at it by 2x2 matrices, and you see that the top right of probably the top left is high cost, low value. You don't want to be there. You want to be in the lower right-hand corner, which is low cost, high value. And the top slide the top of the 3 shows that that in 2 years we've migrated most people from we're heading down and to the right, which is where you want to be. Next slide.
So this is a reconciliation after all of those interventions and after using the data and after implementing gain sharing and after implementing the technological changes. You can see a lot less orange and a lot less red, showing that our quality has gone up and our costs have gone down. We've driven the cost of the episode of care now down below $24,000 for a 90-day episode, and our in-hospital care has gone from $24,000 to $14,000 and change. Next slide, please. This was our most recent reconciliation, but as we've gone forward in 16, it's even gone down even further. But what that displays is there are still some targets here. So if you look at the yellow, those are home health costs. That involves the physical therapy and the visiting nurses. When you look at that as the percentage of care now, before it was 3,000 out of 36,000, not so much. Now it's 4,300 out of 25,000. That's quite a bit. So we can't change the blue. That's the DRG payment. We can't change the professional fees. We've influenced the readmissions as much as we can. We've decreased the SNFs, but the next thing is the home health and the home physical therapy. Next.
Okay, so basically, what Rich just said is absolutely true. Initially, the low-hanging fruit was to take patients from inpatient facilities and then send them home to home with home health care. So to minimize the amount of people going to nurse SNFs and IRFs and other inpatient patient facilities. But once you've done that, like we have at NYU, then you're left with tackling home health care. So, and how do you minimize the amount of home health care? How do you minimize the amount of nurse visits and physical therapists coming to the house? You use technology to leverage that. We happen to choose Force, which is a technology, a web-based company that has its proprietary software that allows us to do web-based physical therapy, that allows us to track our patients, reference-based payment models, and our population health for arthritis. Next. So, you know, a lot of centers around the United States are eliminating all outpatient care, home health services for people with knee hip replacements, because a patient with hip replacement just needs to walk. There's no range of motion. They don't really need a lot of feeding and watering when they're home. It's a little different than a knee replacement. But if you eliminate the use of home health care or minimize it with hip replacements, you're saving a significant amount of money without affecting your outcomes. And the use of EMRs and telehealth can really go a long way of showing this. Next. So again, this is a study where they used home health care with and without, and that what they found is that the results without home health care were just as good as with home health care and a lot less expensive. So there you go, the same equation that Michael Porter came up. Outcomes divided by cost. The outcomes were the same, the cost was less. So in general, patients did much better or just as well clinically, but at a less expensive price if they had no health care, no home health care, but just using telemedicine. So for instance, instead of having a nurse looking at the wound every day, if there was an issue, patient could take a picture of their wound and text it or email it to a secure server to your office so you can look at it together. Next slide. And again, this is a matrix looking at PRO scores, patient-reported outcomes. They can all be done via web-based, and Force offers this service. So again, you can maximize your reimbursement because part of the reimbursement model is having PRO scores on these patients. Next slide. So take-home messages with the integration of technology, we can leverage the amount of decrease the amount of touches with the patient in person, which are less expensive, and use technology to make sure that our patients, the continuum of care is there, but just doing it in a less expensive way to do it. Thanks. Rich, next slide.
Yeah. So in conclusion, you know, we recommend you use evidence-based methodology. You do cost-effectiveness analysis to see what works best for your institution. We recommend you adopt standardized protocols and try and get most people on the same page. That will help your communication. Data is a key here. You need to align your physicians with the hospital. Gain sharing is the best way to do that. And technology can replace FTEs. It can lower costs and can optimize care delivery. And you can apply this methodology to all aspects of care as we've done, and you can be very successful if you do it. But you all have to be on the same page. The administration, the hospitals, the surgeons, and all the care providers need to be together and aligned on this care delivery. And we think value-based care is the best way to take care of our patients. So thank you for listening, and we'll take some questions.
Great. Thank you, folks, very much. It's Scott Becker. I'm going to jump in on questions with Rich and Joe. Thank you. Sorry about that, Margot. Rich and Joe, one of the best webinars presentations I've heard in a long time. Just a lot of specific data and very useful. And I love the concept of ICER, of trying to improve care while reducing cost, and that being the standard that you're aiming for. Just a magnificent presentation. I had a couple questions from the audience and a couple questions I wanted to ask you myself. The first is, Rich and Joe, you guys have been at this for some time, two leading doctors at NYU, just magnificent reputations in this area. How did you get so interested in this, the total joint area, the bundles and total joints? Just if you can give me a moment on that, then I'd like to dig into some questions.
Go ahead, Joe.
Well, I'll go first. You know, we talked a lot about cost and doing things for less, increasing value. But we do this, and I'll speak for Rich, because we think it's best for our patients, and that's the bottom line. We're not looking to save money. We're looking to improve the care of our patients. And that's really what's driven us and what makes us passionate. And plus, and I'll just editorialize for myself a little bit, healthcare is bankrupting this country, and it's making us non-competitive for our industries. You know, you can't sell, GM has a hard time competing with Toyota when it tries to sell a car because it's paying $10,000 per year for every one of its beneficiaries. And Toyotas are made in Japan, they pay $2,000. So healthcare in this country and the rate is being sustained is bankrupting our country. So we think in order to maintain the healthcare system for people, it's important for us to make sure that the spending we do actually provides outcomes. And because we feel that it's better care for our patients, which drives Rich and I. Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, Scott, so Joe Bosco, Joe Zuckerman, our chairman, and Robert Grossman, who's our dean, took a look at our Medicare cost spend and the amount we were being reimbursed. And we clearly were losing money on our Medicare patients circa 2010 to circa 2012. CMS came up with the bundled payment design, and they saw it as an opportunity to expand the episodic care and perhaps improve our quality and maybe get the costs under control. Now, to their credit, they spent a lot of money on infrastructure, but having done so, we didn't make money on everything. We lost some money on spine fusions. We maybe broke even on cardiac valves. But in joint replacement, which lends itself to standardization, they brought me in and they gave me the resources to do the right job, and they're a data-driven organization. So having that data at your disposal and the resources to act on it, and then with the visionary ability to gain share with the physicians for the benefits, we were able to not only improve our quality at every level of care, not just CMS beneficiaries, we also decreased the cost. And that just shows that a lot of what we do in medicine isn't always based on evidence. So we went back to basics, we changed some of what we do, and now we're rewriting the book, and we're considered national thought leaders in this subject. But it all goes back to leadership being willing to change and willing to partner with the physicians to implement better care.
Great. Let me jump into some questions because we've now got a ton of questions here. The first question is, how do you get your data in real time? Do you use a third party to help you access that? Or you developed your own data analytics tools? How do you guys get data? Data is so important to all these things. It keeps people engaged, keeps people interested, it allows them to make changes. How do you get it quickly and on time?
Rich, go ahead.
So we have an enormous data infrastructure here. And in quality improvement. Joe and Lorraine run our quality services for orthopedics. They work very hard with the decision support services and the data bank at Wall Street and at Tisch at the medical school to provide that data. We do our own internal measurements of many of these things. We have high quality hospital cost software which we use. And we track all our own readmissions and complications.
He didn't bring me that.
We use real cost.
No, he left me just a note that said I was here.
Oops. So in other words, we have good data, and none of this stuff is.
I guess I'm just like immune to it at this moment.
Great. I'm not sure who that is talking in the background. If it's one of your rooms, somebody should be on mute. Is great. Let me ask another question. The movement of this to surgery centers. Do you see a lot of movement of this to surgery centers?
Yeah, I think.
He promised he'd be back later.
In New York, it's not.
But I haven't finished with you yet, and he's like, "I'll be back later." So I'm sure we'll see him again.
I don't know who that is, but in other places outside of New York, where dominated by private practitioners in these big groups, like in Charlotte. And up in Twin Cities Orthopedics are migrating their total joints to their own surgery centers. So they're participating in the decision-making and the profitability from doing that.
And there was a question about a comment on population health. Why do you think the model may stop short of population health is the question. I'm not sure if I've categorized it correct or if I've categorized your thoughts correct. Could you guys talk about that, population health and the concept with bundles?
Well, we haven't even gone to managed care as a deep penetrator in New York yet, but we're atypical. There are pockets of the country that may move more quickly toward population health management. But fundamentally, there's a distrust in the medical community among the practitioners of population health and the specialists and care deliverers. So we need to iron that out. It's going to be very difficult.
I'm trying to leave this webinar and it won't let me.
It's going to be very difficult to tease out who is within the bundle and who gets what attributions. You know, PCPs want a piece of the money as far as arthritis bundles go. I think there's going to be bundles of bundles, and we eventually will be parsed out in the treatment of total joint replacement. But I think that's far off in the future right now.
And that's helpful to understand. Let me ask you a follow-up question, Rich and Joe. How do you guys look at the distribution of savings between physicians and hospitals? Are there starting to be guidelines or thoughts on how those things are divided up, or is it really just case by case, deal by deal?
Well, you know, the government is giving its imprimatur to gain sharing, right? And it sets some limits that no more for physicians anyway. We can't get more than 50% of our usual and customary fee, our Medicare allowed fee, in gain sharing. So if you get paid $10 for a procedure, you can only gain share another $5. So that's really put a limit on
it. Rule to expand the amount of gain sharing under the next payment methodology is going to come out in 2018. But there are other ways hospitals can reward surgeons and practitioners. They can use other resources, give them more OR time, more technology. They can draft co-management agreements to give them more treasure as well. So there are ways around the basic rules of gain sharing. And the gain sharing may expand as CMS becomes more comfortable with the arrangements. Anybody there?
Looks like that may be all the time that we have today for questions. We do appreciate everyone calling into the webinar today. We will have the recording and the slides emailed to you in about a week following the webinar. So you can take a look and you'll be able to review the presentation at that point as well. I want to again thank our presenters today for a wonderful presentation. Thank you again.